business perspective. So I'd like to get started with some introductions of ourselves. So I'll start out with me. I am one of the developers here, and I'm super excited about Elixir. I'll talk a little bit more about why in a while, but I've been working here at Gaslight for about 6 months now.
What's your name?
Oh, yes, of course. So my name is Zach Kaiser.
I'm James Smith. I'm a developer here at Gaslight, and I've been working with Elixir for 4 years now, and I'm super excited about it as well, and can't wait to talk about it. So,
I'm Tim Mecklem. I'm a developer here at Gaslight. Been here about 3 years. Made my transition into Rails about the same time that I joined Gaslight, and then James here pretty much convinced me that Elixir was the way to go for some stuff. So I started on some hobby projects, and now building on it full-time consulting-wise. Pretty excited to be on the project that I'm on. We might get into that.
All right, awesome. So I think the first thing that we want to start out with today is something that is, I think, easy for a lot of us to talk about up here. So what do we find most attractive about Elixir? So how about we'll start with James?
Sure. All right. So the thing that I find the most attractive or interesting about Elixir, I guess two things. The first thing that really got me interested in Elixir was I had been going to a local meetup group here in Cincinnati for about 2 years. That was the Cincinnati Functional Web Development or Functional Programming Group. And it was heavily Clojure based, which was really cool. I like Clojure. It's a really nice language, but coming from Ruby, Clojure and functional programming was a bit much for me, and it took me a long time to really kind of understand some of the concepts. And then someone gave a presentation on Elixir, and immediately, and some of it was just the syntax, but immediately all of the things I had been learning about functional programming suddenly made sense. I went out and bought Dave Thomas's book and read it cover to cover in probably 3 or 4 weeks, I guess. And yeah, so I think the thing that was attractive is it felt familiar, yet very similar to some of the things that I was hearing about Clojure that was exciting. So that was one of the things. And the other thing for me was immediately it opened up more possibilities. The kind of applications I was developing in Ruby, I felt like I was hitting limitations, whether that was the limitations for performance or the limitations on the kinds of applications I was building. I wanted to do more and more real-time applications, and Ruby didn't quite feel as a natural fit for that. And Elixir just readily adopts that and is part of the language.
Thank you, James. How about you, Tim?
The thing by far that I like about Elixir the most is its flexibility. I come into languages usually from a different door than everyone else. I think that most people who have looked at Elixir have looked at it within the context of Phoenix, which is the web application framework that it uses, kind of like Rails. I don't know why I just always tend to take a different path. And so my path into it was through a project called Nerves. And Nerves is a way for you to take the Elixir code that you write and embed it onto something like a Raspberry Pi. And so what got me really excited is that I got to pull that Raspberry Pi that I had sitting on a shelf off and do something useful with it. And of course that always starts with making a light blink. So I made a light blink, and then I just kind of like, okay, what do I do now? And I started playing with it and understanding. I built a little quiz buzzer board system with it. That was fun.
That was cool.
And as I realized the power that I had at my fingertips when I was writing this Elixir code and running it on Raspberry Pis, it led me to a different project of a different scale, which was the automatic pancreas system project that I started. And so I actually got to write an Elixir application that controls an insulin pump and listens for glucose information and everything. And so like just the immense amount of flexibility that it had to be able to run this code on a tiny little Raspberry Pi or on my laptop or on a server, and it was just the same code being deployed different places. It's fascinating to me. It's amazing to me because there's other languages that have made that claim with varying degrees of success. But Elixir is the first one that I could take to from a syntax perspective, like you were saying, from like understanding what it's doing, but still not being like so far beyond my grasp that I would have to like rethink everything I know about programming languages, but at the same time still be able to run it on this pretty constrained hardware by today's standards. So flexibility by far.
Great. And so for me, I think the most attractive thing for me about Elixir is just its productivity. And coming from me, I actually started programming only a few years ago. And when I first started, I actually got started in Ruby and did that for about a year. And the thing that I really like about Ruby is that Ruby allows you to be productive and iterate quickly and things like that. It's like one of the things that the Ruby community does very well. So I found out about Elixir about a year into my programming path. And there was things that I was having trouble with in Ruby, just like what James was saying. It's not the right tool for the job sometimes. So I picked up Elixir. I picked up Dave Thomas's book, Programming Elixir, which is a great place to start if you're interested in learning about Elixir. And within a month, I started working on a side project where I was building out a Texas Hold'em game. And within about 3 or 4 months or so, and again, as a beginning programmer, like I was just starting out. It had only been about a year into my career. Within 3 or 4 months, I had a server up and running where I had 1,000 games running concurrently that people can just join and
Nice.
play online, which is it's really cool, really powerful. And I feel like that would have been something that would have been really, really difficult to do, not only in Ruby, but also in other languages. And I think another thing that's really attractive about Elixir to me is it just does concurrency very, very well. And granted, asynchronous and concurrent programming is something that will never be easy, but your language can make it easy for you or it can make it difficult for you. So working full-time here now, I do a lot of work in Java, and I'm sure as everybody knows, you can get really good performance out of Java, out of the JVM. The problem though is you have to really fight to make that work. Whereas if you're doing it in Elixir or Erlang, which is essentially those two languages run on the same virtual machine, it takes care of a lot of the difficult parts of that for you. You don't have to manage threads by yourself most of the time. It just will extract that all away. The VM will take care of it for you. And I just find that really, really attractive about Elixir.
Yeah. Yeah. The ability, so one of the things we were finding in our Rails applications was we had to optimize our code earlier than we wanted to, right? You can definitely write optimized Ruby code, but optimizing your code is always slower, right? It's always harder. You feel less connected to the domain of the application you're building. And one of the things I think we've found as a company is that Elixir has helped us delay those decisions. Writing the code in a domain-centric way was fast enough longer down the road, right?
Yeah. All right. So I think that it pretty much explains a lot of the reasons why we're super excited about Elixir. So the next thing that we want to move on is it's a question that we actually get asked quite a lot. So traditionally here at Gaslight, we've been a Ruby shop, and we specialized in Ruby for a long time. And we're now starting this move towards Elixir. And so a lot of people are just really curious about what our transition has been like. So what are some of the experiences that we've had transitioning from Ruby to being more Elixir focused? So Tim, do you want to start with this one?
Yeah, sure. So it's been easy and hard, I think. Rails at a similar point in its adoption cycle was relatively hard for us to sell, I think. Like just as an ecosystem, as everybody trying to work on Rails applications. Like I was a Java developer thinking, boy, wouldn't it be cool if I could work on Rails, but I couldn't deploy it and keep it running for more than a few minutes and things would crash. And I remember thinking, this thing is just too early. And there was a point at which Elixir kind of had that feel, right? Like there were a lot of questions that were still unanswered. People were still trying to figure out what exactly it meant to do that. And largely those have been solved over time. So when James first introduced me to Elixir, I thought, I don't even know what you're talking about, gen servers, like OTP concepts that are on top of Elixir. And I was just kind of like pushing it away because I was just trying to get a handle on Rails well. So the hard parts have kind of eased into the parts that give us direct benefit. One of the things that would give us Some of the things that we consider when we're trying to figure out what the best technology for our customer is, Elixir has a good answer for right out of the box. So with Rails for a long time, we had to use things like Pusher. We had to reach for ways to run asynchronous jobs. We would always have to kind of reach outside the Rails ecosystem. Now Rails has started to build all of that into it, which is good. And I think that some of that pressure has been positive from Elixir because you just kind of get a lot of that stuff out of the box with it. So it's been exciting because a lot of the hard problems have become easier in both ecosystems. It also, Elixir also, its syntax is similar enough to Ruby that we can jump right in. Like you can read Elixir code similar to how you read Ruby code. So as a dev shop of Ruby developers, seeing Elixir is not completely outside of like what we would recognize. Now that's basically as far as it seems to go. So Elixir as a language is much, much different underneath the covers from Ruby, but it is kind of a nice, easy, gentle transition into the language. So as a Ruby shop transitioning to Elixir on some of our projects, like that's been pretty good.
Yeah, so what it's been like transitioning, that's interesting. Like you said, the syntax definitely makes the beginning conversations easier, right? One of the things I love about Elixir is the things that I loved about Ruby is that it's very expressive. The syntax allows you to express a problem in a readable way. But I will say, like, one of the things we found is that there are kind of plateaus to learning Elixir, right? And that first plateau is like, oh, this is just like Ruby and I can write things exactly like Ruby, and that might not be a good thing, right? And so you kind of get past that and you start getting more into the functional elements of Elixir, and your code goes through some changes. Then you kind of level off a little bit and start learning about processes and distributed systems. And that's one of the things that I think is interesting for us as a consultancy, because Elixir has opened up so many new opportunities to build different kinds of applications. It means that we're building more complex systems than we were able to in the past, like you said, in Elixir. So whereas in the past we would reach for Rails right? Like your application was always Rails and MailChimp and Pusher and Redis and some feature of Postgres, right? Now most of that is written in Elixir, so the code is more cohesive, but at the same time we're thinking about building distributed systems and exciting stuff, and that's been a learning curve for us to learn about, and it's been exciting, but it's also not been easy. I'm not going to lie. Like there's been some growth, but I think that's good. That's exciting.
I think the transition from Ruby to Elixir is really interesting, and it seems like if you're in the Elixir community, or if you've looked around the Elixir community at all, you'll see a lot of influence from Ruby, and even if you're looking at things like Phoenix as well, you'll see some influence from Rails. So in a sense, when you're coming to Elixir from Ruby, you have some familiarity with the people who are working in the Elixir community because they came from Ruby originally. Jose Valim, who's the creator of Elixir, used to be a member of the Rails core team. And then there's been a lot of transition over from the Ruby community as well. So there's a lot of things that the community share that they have in common. But when you get really down into the weeds in Elixir, even though it looks superficially on the surface, it does look like Ruby. The syntax looks similar to Ruby. Semantically, it's very different because it runs on the Erlang, the Erlang VM that we were talking about earlier. And what does that mean? That means that you have access to all this stuff on your runtime, your virtual machine, that you don't have access to in Ruby. So we've got access to 20 or 30 years of really, really sophisticated technological development that the Erlang community did. And so if you've ever used any kind of telephone system in your life, you've probably used some kind of Erlang software, some kind of software written in Erlang. And its goals were to have fault tolerance, so if something goes down, it can spin back up. Concurrency, distribution, that's the kind of problems that Erlang was designed to solve. Now where Elixir comes into that is Elixir runs on the same virtual machine, but as opposed to Erlang, if you look at Erlang and you're coming from a language like Ruby, it looks like some really, really esoteric language, just because of the syntax is something that you're just generally not used to. It's, but having the syntax, the friendly syntax that Elixir has, that looks like Ruby, I think it makes it easier for not only Rubyists to transition into the Erlang and to working on the Beam, but I think it is also helpful for people from other languages. If you're coming from Java or C#, some other languages, I think that Elixir would be an easier way for you to pick up functional programming and programming for distributed systems.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's one of the things that the Erlang community has found is that the adoption for the Beam has increased because of Elixir, because the syntax and the tooling. So Ruby is known for having really great tools, and because of that culture coming into Elixir, Elixir has some really great tools like the build tool and task system mix and hex packages, and because of that, it's a nice welcome mat, right, to Erlang. It's before you were greeted with, okay, well you're going to need to learn this complex shared nothing architecture and a language that syntax was similar to a language called Prolog, which a few of us may have done in college, but is quite unfamiliar, right? And Elixir just kind of greets you with this, oh, it's similar to Ruby and it's readable, or Python. It has some Python influence too, I think. So.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Did you have anything else to add, Tim?
Nope, not on that one. No.
Okay. All right, so we'll move on to our next topic here. So the next topic that we have is, I think, maybe more interesting for people who are looking at Elixir from a business standpoint. So a question that we get asked a lot is, what has Elixir meant for our clients? And also, to go along with that, what are some things that our clients who are adopting Elixir, what are they benefiting from that they maybe don't know about?
That's a good question. Yeah. Do you want to start, or do you want me to start? Yeah. Okay.
I'll let you take this one.
All right. So the thing that I think, so this is Gaslight is on its, I think, 7th Elixir project now, which is really exciting. 7 projects in 4 years is pretty good for a new technology. And so one of the things, I've been on 3 of those, I think, and one of the things that I've found that our clients benefit from that they might not know about is kind of the earlier discussion we're having around scalability, but also something you mentioned just a second ago is stability. So because Elixir because Erlang, and by property Elixir, has this idea of fault tolerance to be able to recover from crashes, because it has that, I think our clients have really benefited from stability, and they may not realize it. Because a good application, when it's running, if it crashes and recovers well, no one should ever know, right? It's so the application I'm working on right now is a real-time auction application, and one of the things that we've had to think about, but also Elixir has covered really well, is if the auction crashes while people are bidding, how do you recover, right? And because Erlang gives you the tools as a first-class part of the language, we were able to recover from any crash that happens and rebuild the state of the auction and keep on going, and the users probably won't even know. So they're benefiting from that. And the other is the scalability, really, is that server costs are at a certain scale are a big issue, but a lot of our clients don't have that problem. But what they are benefiting from, what they don't realize, is their server costs are very low because a lot of the applications are a single application server. Chris McCord, the author of Phoenix, about a year ago did a test, and they were able to get 2 million WebSocket connections on a single server. And since now it was a beefy server, but being able to reduce your server costs without increasing the complexity of your system is a really awesome thing. So
I think that kind of maybe elaborating on something that you brought up, the let it crash mentality of Elixir allows developers to be more productive without having to think about the edge cases of every potential thing that could go wrong. And so where in just about every other language I've ever dealt with, you have the happy path and you're building value for your customer as a consultant, right? You're writing code, everything's great, you have some tests, they're all green, and then you run into something either in production or in staging or in testing that you're like, oh wow, I didn't even think about this situation coming up, and you have to add another card to the backlog and you have to do this other work that is really not going to happen in production that often. And you kind of wish that you didn't have to do. Like the customer or the client of Gaslight wishes that we wouldn't have to deal with this because it's work related to not value, right? To things that are not as valuable. They just can't happen in production. Versus when we're doing this in Elixir and we're like, okay, well, we just saw something strange come back from this third-party service and we've never seen that before. What other things could come up? We don't actually have to answer that question. We can just say, it doesn't actually matter. If they're having a bad day, it doesn't mean that we have to have a bad day. We can just let everything crash. The supervisor tree, the structure of OTP on Elixir allows us to just recover from that as though nothing happened. And we can build in things like circuit breakers. We can be aware of the fact that they're having a bad day and maybe code something in the future if it's a big issue, but we don't actually have to address that to go live with the software the first time. And so there's increased value or increased time to value when you can actually realize the value that you've created without having to account for every single edge case in every scenario, which you know you can't do anyway.
that's right, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with these guys completely. I mean, the fault tolerance that Elixir brings to the table adds to something I think I mentioned a little bit earlier about productivity. And the way that fault tolerance and the supervision trees that you can set up in Elixir and Erlang help with productivity is they make it so that you don't have to focus on these small edge cases that you may or may not know will maybe happen sometime in the future. So that it lets you focus on delivering value to the customer, and you can focus on the happy path and let some of these other kind of very, very small, minuscule edge cases just slip by, and your runtime will just recover for you. So I think that's really amazing. That's something that anyone who's running on Elixir or Erlang is going to benefit from. And as James was alluding to earlier, just being in the Elixir community for a while, you hear kind of these anecdotes about like how much money people are saving on server costs, which can be huge amounts of money for some other languages. So I've heard a story that I think it was Bleacher Report had something like 240 Python servers, and they switched over to Elixir, and they narrowed that down to 4 servers. So that's quite a gain. Granted, I don't think that all of your use cases are going to be that startling. But
well, they said 4 because the other 2 was just for redundancy. They didn't actually need them.
Yes, right. So, yeah.
Well, it's also something that you have to be a little bit careful with, because if you're the client of another service, it's totally possible for you to write code that's concurrently able to basically take down that third-party service from a laptop because of the way that Elixir has just got it built in. Like, you could potentially do some damage just without even thinking about it, because Elixir's so fast and so good at parallelizing work and making it concurrent. So,
right.
Yeah.
And it's getting better too. There's some great projects in the community that are getting adoption. The GenStage library that Jose has been working on. That allows you to do some things that you would normally reach to, like Apache Spark or some cloud platform that you would be locked into. He's working on something so you can basically guarantee back pressure in the system, so you can have parallelism and not overwhelm external services. So it's exciting stuff.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and just to add to that too, I've heard questions from different communities too about like, well, why use Elixir if you can do basically the same things on the JVM, right? And the JVM is maybe it's more I guess well known than the Beam, so there's more people obviously who are familiar with the JVM. I know like most enterprises are doing something on the JVM usually, so people are comfortable with it, and they make the argument sometimes. Why use Elixir or Erlang when you could just use Java and Kafka and Kubernetes and like all of these different solutions together
yeah.
and all of these things, right? And I think that like the really attractive thing about Elixir is that the Beam, the Erlang virtual machine, packages all of those tools together. You almost never have to reach outside if you don't want to. You just have it there in your runtime. There's a built-in database, distributed database called Amnesia.
Yeah.
They have some pretty fast lookup tables in memory. It's called ETS. You can basically use it like just an in-memory store. And just a whole bunch of other things.
20 years of stuff, right? Like the, I was joking with someone that we should do a blog series, and maybe we should do this on OTP archaeology. So that, Erlang's been around for 20 years, and all of the stuff, it was originally for running phone switches. At one point, I don't know if it's still the case, but 50% of data traffic through the cell phone network was happening through Erlang. So all of the libraries for routing calls are still in there. So you can switch calls if you needed to. There's just so many great tools. So one of the arguments I hear about the JVM is like, oh, but there's like 20 years of experience in the JVM, and that's true, but there's also 20 years of experience in Erlang. I think a lot of people don't realize how old Erlang is. And it's reaching the same levels of maturity.
Right.
So,
all right. You guys have any more to add before we move on to questions?
I would love to answer some questions if the audience has any.
All right. So let's see. So we have a little bit of time for QA. So do we have any questions from the audience?
We have 2 right now, but feel free to type them in the chat as you come up with them. The first one you guys touched on quickly. But maybe you could elaborate just a little bit more. So Charles asked, quick take on Elixir relation to Erlang.
Yeah. So as far as relating, Elixir runs on top of the Erlang virtual machine, and you actually end up using quite a bit of Erlang when you're doing Elixir. So there's interoperability between both languages. You can actually call Erlang functions from Elixir, and you can call Elixir functions from Erlang. And you do. Jose, in his wisdom, has said, I want Elixir to be a small language. And so he has purposefully, the things that Erlang does very well, he has not wrapped, right? And so you end up learning a little bit of Erlang as you go. I think one of the common questions I hear too is like, do I need to learn Erlang before I learn Elixir? And the answer is no. I would say that in diving into Elixir, you eventually learn the semantics of Erlang. And the syntax that looked really, really funky to me before that I had trouble learning because I had looked at Erlang in the past, suddenly makes sense to me now. And I didn't go and learn Erlang syntax. It's just the semantics made the syntax make more sense. But luckily I had Elixir to be nice and guide me through that process and hold my hand, right?
Yeah.
And it was really fantastic. I hope that answers that question. If not, put it in the chat. Yeah.
If I could just add a little bit to that too,
Yeah.
I think so. If you're looking at the question of how does Erlang relate to Elixir in terms of if you're coming to Elixir from Erlang, you're going to have different syntax, but the semantics of it is pretty much exactly the same. Whereas Ruby has the same syntax or similar syntax to Elixir, but really they're very different. So I feel like Erlang developers coming to Elixir are going to have a really easy time picking it up. Should be just like speaking a different dialect of your own language.
I don't really have anything to add. I mean, basically, I think my experience was the same. I learned Elixir first. I kind of was a little bit afraid of Erlang. And I was like, I don't really want to touch this. And then I had to run timer.sleep the first time or something like that. And I was like, okay, well, this isn't so bad. It's sort of wrapped pretty well. And then I started learning more about OTP engine servers and tasks and agents and all the things that come along with OTP that came with the Erlang ecosystem. And I'm like, yes, I want more of this. So I'm not actively picking up more Erlang, but I think that they work together well when they need to. And I think you're seeing less people. Well, maybe this is true, maybe not. You're seeing less of these libraries that are basically taking Erlang directly and just porting over the exact same code to an Elixir package.
Yeah, don't do that, by the way.
So I think that the ecosystems are working well together, and as a developer, it's a relatively seamless transition when I need to use Erlang and I'm writing in Elixir.
Yeah, I just thought of something too, and how Elixir relates to Erlang, and I think one of the things about it is that for Erlang developers, I do hear that come up a lot, like why should I, as an Erlang developer, be using Elixir? And I think the answer is that the culture that Elixir has come from Ruby and a few other sources benefits the Erlang developer also. The tooling is very modern. One of the criticisms of Erlang for a long time has been the tooling really hasn't kept pace. There wasn't really a definitive package management system in Erlang. Not the way we think of it, where I can search for a package and I can bring it in a standardized way into my project, and the build tool manages all that for me. Elixir brings that to the Erlang ecosystem, and I think that, along with the culture of testing, is really been powerful even for just Erlang developers. We're seeing a lot of people who were Erlang developers for a long time start to write more and more Elixir. Devin Torres was a pretty well-known Erlang developer. He was Pool Boy, and we use that all the time, whether we know it or not, because Phoenix uses Pool Boy under the covers for connection pooling. But he, that library is in Erlang. It is wrapped in a hex package, and we bring it in. So the two communities are starting to coexist, and really innovation is happening because of it, and that's exciting. So I think that's another way that Elixir can relate to Erlang.
Cool. So we have a couple more questions. I think we'll have enough time to address them, but we'll try to wrap up here in a few. So we have a question. Actually, David has three different questions, all worth addressing, I think.
Awesome.
I think they're good questions. So
Thank you, David.
We'll start with the first. Are you traditional relationship database for persistence, or something unique to the Elixir Erlang ecosystem?
So I guess I can start with that. So if you're working in Elixir, and especially if you're using Phoenix, you're going to be using Postgres by default. So you have a traditional relational database. That being said, you have inside of the Beam, you have an embedded distributed database called Amnesia, which is specific to Erlang, and that would be something that you'd have to learn how to use. I don't actually know all that much about Amnesia myself because I've never had to use it. I just usually
You've forgotten it all.
Yeah, I've forgotten it all because I have amnesia.
Sorry. That's terrible.
How about you guys? Have you done a lot with
I think maybe one of the more interesting points to make about like whether or not you're using a relational data store for what you're doing is that you don't actually have to think about it immediately. There's a great book out called, I think, Functional Web Development with Elixir, Phoenix, and OTP.
Yeah,
I might be
Lance.
wrong on the order, by Lance.
Right?
And basically the first half of the book is like, don't even worry about persistence. We're going to build this thing to cater to the business needs of the problem that we're trying to solve, and then we're going to think about persistence later. And that's just, I mean, it's really difficult to do that in a language and a framework that like makes you think about the persistence up front. But because of the way that Elixir allows you to store state and move it throughout the system, you don't really have to think about persistence right away. Having said that, I haven't done anything persistence-wise other than maybe writing to JSON files and doing Postgres. So those are like kind of the Postgres is really the default angle if you're going to do relational database.
Yeah, like you mentioned, Phoenix by default comes with Ecto, which is another completely independent hex package library. If you're coming from Rails, you would use Active Record as your ORM. Ecto is not really an ORM, it's a database mapping library that allows you to interact with a traditional relational database. And by default, the default adapter is Postgres. Postgres is a great database. We used it a lot in Rails. But there's also adapters for MySQL and Mongo, and now there's an Oracle adapter that one of our clients actually has put out there that seems to be getting some traction, and that's cool. Yeah, so you can still deal with the relational database, but you can delay that decision, which is nice.
Cool. So David has 2 more questions. We have one by John, and then we'll wrap. So David's second question was, the Erlang platform string handling is seen as somewhat weak or incomplete compared to other languages. Have you experienced this in practice?
Does anybody else? I haven't experienced it as much. It is commonly said. The interesting thing about that is that Erlang used to not support binary strings, and when Elixir was written, that was the case. So there are 2 types of strings in Elixir. There's binary strings, and then there's the traditional Erlang strings, which are char lists, literally like list of characters, right? And the addition of binary strings has basically been a really good thing for Erlang, and I think it addresses some of those traditional arguments. That being said, Erlang is still never going to be the fastest kit out there for processing strings, but what I've found is that it's fast enough for most of what I want to do. And binary strings has helped that more. So binary strings are just how you would think of strings in Ruby, really, to be honest.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that assessment, and I have ran into, you will run into some funkiness if you're using IEX, which is the built-in REPL, read, evaluate, print loop for Elixir. So if you're just playing around with strings in there or char lists or whatever, you'll get some strange output, like it'll interpret some of your strings as a number or like an integer if you have it as a char list. So that can be frustrating at times, but that said, what Erlang doesn't do so well, Elixir does very well. So their string, the string module exposes a bunch of functions that you can run on strings. And that allows you to do a lot of really complicated processing and work with strings. So if you're approaching the beam from Elixir, I think that's another one of its benefits, is it handles strings very well. Yeah. Also encodings, Elixir does a great job with encodings.
Yeah, I think Tim could probably...
Yeah, in the interest of time, I won't say too much about it, but you can binary pattern match. Like you can pattern match stuff out of a binary stream and do things with it natively within Elixir, and like the same amount of code, the same amount of work done in a different language is so much more verbose and many more lines of code, and it's just a pleasant experience to deal with pattern matching in Elixir, which we don't really have time to get into, but we'd certainly be willing to follow up if anybody wants to contact us.
Yeah, please do. I'd love to talk.
All right, so David's last question. Do you miss anything about not working in an object-oriented language?
Yes. There are times that I know what I would reach for in Ruby in terms of how I would model a domain problem. This is really more me and still really getting my feet wet and really becoming an advanced Elixir user from one that can just get something done. But I know a lot of times how I would model something in an object-oriented world that I'm not immediately aware of how I would do it in Elixir. Having said that, I have had so many occasions where I've thought, I have no idea how I'm going to even do this. I write a test in Elixir, it gets the ball rolling, and an hour later I've solved this problem that I had no idea how to solve at the beginning of it. The speed at which I can get from, I have a problem I need to solve, to, oh wow, I'm done with this problem now, I've actually solved it and I have tests around it. Like, I don't know how to describe that any better than what I just did, but it's phenomenal. It's really eerie and kind of cool.
I'm gonna cop out and say no. I think the reason is, one of the things I've found is the Ruby I was writing before was not as object-oriented and was a little more on the functional side. And I never really understood object-oriented programming probably as much as I needed to. Functional style just seems to match the way I like to think about writing programs and breaking things down into data transformations. But I will say that one of the things that normally when I would reach for an object, one of the things I found is that really OTP gen servers are, or processes in general, are really kind of the analog to that in that you have both state and behavior in the same place, and that's really what an object is. And then on top of that, being able to not share anything between those and have immutability and only mutate my objects, processes through message passing has made me feel like in some ways Elixir is a better object-oriented language than languages I've used in the past that were object-oriented. So,
yeah, and so I think my experience is a little bit interesting because I wasn't ingrained in the object-oriented sphere for very long. I spent about a year doing Ruby and trying to do object-oriented programming the right way. And then I came to Elixir about a year later, as I was referring to earlier. And I think I'll agree with James. I think that the functional way of thinking was just so much more intuitive to me. And even still, I still do a lot of object-oriented work here. And I'm always fighting with, okay, I have this data and this behavior coupled together, and like sometimes things are being mutated in a place that you don't expect it to be mutated, and you don't really have to worry about that in Elixir because you have immutability guarantees, you generally have very small functions, and you know for the most part, unless you're running side effects, which is something that I guess that's a whole other topic that we can speak about. You can run side effects in Elixir, of course, but generally you want to have pure functions in Elixir. They're super easy to test, they're small, and just for me, thinking data goes in this function, comes out on the other side. If I pass it this data, it should spit this thing out every time. It makes it very easy for me to think about functions on a small scale. And then if you look at it from a program level, you basically just have a pipe of, you have some data come in at the very top of your program and it just spits it out at the very end. And I just find that to be a much more intuitive model for programming systems than object-oriented programming is.
Cool. So last question, 60 seconds, and then we'll wrap.
Gone in 60 seconds.
So John, thanks for the question. With the Elixir projects at Gaslight, have they all used Phoenix as well?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. I mean, that's probably not a big surprise. We're a web application development shop mostly. Like a lot of the things that we have done are web applications traditionally, but I will say that there were a lot more non-Phoenix parts of our application than maybe would have been Rails in the past. So for instance, we did a project that had a component where it was talking to GPS devices and tracking school buses in real time, and that was a separate Elixir application that didn't have Phoenix, and I think OTP allows you to do that more and structure smaller microservices in your application that are OTP applications, and you can really design your application outside of Phoenix. And Phoenix is the web interface to your application, but your real application is just Elixir, and it is mapped to your domain, not the web. And I've enjoyed that about Phoenix, is being able to treat it as just the web front end of my application.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think on my even on my side projects, it's like, well, I do want to expose it to the web eventually, but I'm just writing the logic and the system in Elixir, and Phoenix can come later.
Cool.
All right. Well, so thank you all for joining us today, and this has been good, I think, for us to be able to talk about one of the languages that we love here. And if you have any questions, please feel free to follow up with us after the event. Thank you.